Hello, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining us for tonight's Olana webinar. My name is Carolyn Keogh, and I'm the Director of Education and Public Programs at the Olana Partnership. Please welcome the Olana Partnership's wonderful Director of Collections and Exhibitions, William Coleman, who will introduce this evening's speaker, who's joining us tonight, Rosalyn Elder. Thanks, everyone.
Well, thank you, Carolyn. Thank you for being with us for another Olana webinar. We're really pleased to be doing something that's a priority for all of us at Olana, which is using the incredible state of preservation of this remarkable place that we represent to raise up some stories that have been a little less well preserved. And the one we share tonight could not be more aligned with our own. Another 19th century life, another 19th century landscape painter. I quickly refreshed my memory of this person's dates. 1828 to 1901, as you may recall, Frederick Church of Olana. 1826 to 1900. They're fellow travelers, and yet their journeys are so different and their work is so different. So I'm looking forward to learning more from our speaker tonight, Rosalyn Elder. Rosalyn is a registered architect, entrepreneur, author, and artist. She received her bachelor's in art history from the University of Memphis, her master's of architecture from the University of Washington, and a second master's in urban design from Harvard. Especially worth noting is her very interesting book, Exploring the Legacy, People and Places of Significance, which is available on Amazon and many other outlets, on the contributions of African Americans to both Massachusetts history and our country's history. So please join me in welcoming Rosalyn. Rosalyn, you can take it away. I know that we're going to be sharing your PowerPoint from a separate machine here, so we'll get that started in just a moment. There we are.
Thank you, Will. Can you hear me?
Rosalyn, we can hear you, but if you could just turn your camera on, that would be great.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me now? And
sounds great. Thank you.
Okay, I'm sorry. I had to go get my earphones. Thank you for the introduction and for the opportunity to speak on Edward Bannister tonight. I really appreciate this. So Edward Bannister achieved significant success as a practicing artist in New England during the late 19th century. That level of success was considered normal within the context of his artistic community. He accepted commissions, he painted, socialized with his peers, and in his leisure time, sailed his boat along the Narragansett Bay. Throughout it all, Bannister was developing a deeply spiritual connection between his art and nature. That success did not happen in a vacuum, however. It owed a debt of gratitude to a long lineage of African-American artists and craftspeople whose perseverance in pursuing their artistic careers paved the way for Bannister's achievements. Next. This presentation will provide a brief overview of Bannister's career, as well as that of some of those early artists who paved the way for Bannister to be able to achieve his success. My goal in this presentation will be to provide some context to understand why Bannister's career, which was considered normal to his New England peers, was really exceptional given the context of American history. African Americans were brought to the Americas as early as 1619 as enslaved laborers. Initially, those individuals had the opportunity to earn their freedom as did white indentured servants. But with the passing of a Virginia law in 1662, slavery became a condition of perpetual servitude or permanent enslavement. And that condition was inherited through the mother. Within the context of permanent enslavement, African-American life was highly restricted in order to prevent those enslaved from learning to read and write. Those were skills thought to encourage frustrations among those enslaved with their existing situations. Lacking those skills also served to limit their abilities to communicate with others in similar situations. Despite those restrictions, African Americans sought ways to express themselves artistically, and those earliest African American artistic expressions were often in the crafts or utilitarian items for survival, as can be seen from the examples on the screen. Next. Africans were very skilled in the art of blacksmithing. And when they were kidnapped and enslaved, they brought those skills with them to America. Their artistry created the visual identity that the coastal cities of Savannah, Georgia, Charleston, South Carolina, and New Orleans, Louisiana are known for today. Next. Furniture making was another skill that was valued in the enslaved community. A freed African-American, Thomas Day, was a leading cabinet maker in North Carolina in the early 1800s. Day was such a popular cabinet maker for the wealthy plantation owners of North Carolina that when he decided to marry a freed African-American woman from Virginia, which was against North Carolina law, the legislature passed an exemption to that law for Mrs. Day in order for the marriage to proceed. Thomas Day had threatened to relocate his business elsewhere if that exemption was not granted. Next. It was in the development of crafts for their own use that an affiliation with the artistic heritage of Africa was most pronounced. Today, basket weaving is still a traditional craft in most African countries as it was years ago. And when Africans were enslaved and brought to the States, they brought that skill with them. Initially weaving baskets for purely utilitarian purposes and later adding a decorative element to them. Next. Cloth weaving was also a valued skill on all plantations, and enslaved African Americans were forced to use that skill to benefit their enslavers. Plantation owners wanted to make sure that there were a sufficient number of enslaved cloth spinners, weavers, and dyers on the grounds, because that ensured a self-sustaining community, which in turn increased their profits. Next. Enslaved African Americans were the builders of colonial America as well, and the mansions and civic buildings of the period owed their existence to that enslaved labor. When it was time for the enslaved to build structures for their own use, they utilized quite a few of the architectural traditions and forms that they remembered from Africa, especially for those structures in the South, which were built to maximize cooling and air circulation in the hot, humid Southern climate. Next. This painting, The Old Plantation, is not signed, but it is believed to be the work of an unidentified African-American artist. It depicts enslaved people entertaining themselves with instruments of African origin, such as the banjo, which was cherished in African-American communities in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. Next. As this country developed and expanded, a different approach to enslavement also developed along geographical lines. In the South, an agrarian economy supported large plantations whose profitability was maximized by the use of massive amounts of enslaved labor, as can be seen in the photo on the right. In the North, a mercantile economy was developed, which lessened the need for enslaved labor in the immediate workforce. So most northern states eventually abolished enslavement after the American Revolution of 1776. Interestingly, although slavery was abolished in the North, many of those northern mercantile fortunes were based on the cotton that came from the enslaved labor in the South. Using enslaved labor made it possible to keep the price of cotton down, which was an economic benefit to both the North and the South. Next. Before the American Revolution, most African Americans in the North were still enslaved and concerned primarily with survival. But that status did not stop their creative urge, and some, such as the poet Phillis Wheatley and the engraver Scipio Moorhead, found a way to express themselves artistically. As you may already know the story of Phillis Wheatley, she was born around 1753. Phillis was an accomplished poet who was enslaved by the Wheatley family of Boston. Phillis Wheatley remained enslaved until the Wheatleys were pressured by the British to manumit her in 1773. Scipio Moorhead was enslaved by Reverend John Moorhead of Boston. Reverend Moorhead's wife, Sarah, recognized Scipio's talents and tutored him in the arts. The Moorheads and the Wheatleys moved in the same social circle in Boston, which is how Scipio and Phyllis knew each other. Phyllis commissioned Scipio to complete an engraving of her, which graced the cover of her first book of poems. If not for Phyllis Wheatley's poem, To S.M., a young African painter, on seeing his works, the world may never have known of Scipio Moorhead. In 1775, Scipio Moorhead was auctioned off as part of an estate sale and never heard of again. That event occurred 5 years before the state of Massachusetts ended the practice of slavery. Next. Those merchant barons of the North wanted to display their wealth, so they commissioned family or individual portraits as an ideal way to accomplish that goal. Remember, this was before photography, and only the wealthiest families could afford that luxury. So an oil portrait became a status symbol, and those early African-American fine artists focused on portrait painting because that was what sold. Joshua Johnson, excuse me, was one of those early pioneers in portrait painting. Johnson, who was born enslaved around 1763 in Baltimore, Maryland, was manumitted in 1784 at a time when slavery was still the law in that state. In fact, slavery did not end in Maryland until 1864, just before the onset of the Civil War. And it is well known for its harsh slave environment. So much so that two of the most famous fugitives from slavery, Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass, both escaped slavery from Maryland. Despite the fact that slavery was the status quo in that state, Johnson's skills allowed him to cultivate a client base of wealthy white merchants who valued his talents, such as the McCormick family in the painting on the right. Johnson painted in a style known as American Primitive, a style characterized by stiff poses and a naive handling of proportions and perspectives. The portrait of Abner Coker, also famously known as Portrait of a Cleric on the left, is one of only two that Johnson completed of an African American, because very few African Americans had the financial means to commission portraits. Abner was a cleric of the African Methodist Episcopal Church, one of the first national organizations created by African Americans. Next. An artistic contemporary of Joshua Johnson, Moses Williams, was born enslaved in 1777 in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He and his parents were given to the artist Charles Wilson Peale as payment for a portrait. The Peale family was considered the first family of American artists, and of their 7 children, 3 of them also became famous artists: Raphael, Rembrandt, and Rubens. A gradual emancipation law that was passed in Pennsylvania in 1780 freed African Americans of a certain age, so Williams' parents became free, but Moses could not gain his freedom until he was 27. He continued to be enslaved by Peale. Although Moses Williams indicated artistic skill, Charles Peale refused to train him as an oil painter. Peale felt that oil painting was a skill above Williams' station in life. Instead, Peale taught Moses the craft of silhouette making, a craft that was considered a lower status than painting. After Moses gained his freedom, he continued to work at the Peale Museum in Philadelphia, where he earned between 6 and 8 cents for each silhouette he made of visitors to the museum. Those earnings enabled him to buy his own home and to marry. Next. Artists need patrons to survive, and many African Americans found those patrons in 2 economic centers in the United States, Philadelphia and New Orleans. An artist community developed in Philadelphia because that city contained the largest population of middle-class African Americans in the country at that time. That middle class developed out of the founding of such groups as the Free African Society, which was a mutual aid organization founded by Richard Allen and Absalom Jones in 1787. It was founded to assist Africans newly freed by Pennsylvania's Gradual Emancipation Law of 1780, the same law that freed Moses Williams' parents. Another factor that helped grow that Black middle class was the establishment of the African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas in 1792. That church evolved into the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was founded by Richard Allen shortly thereafter. This pastel of Richard Allen was done by G.W. Hobbs, who was himself a minister in the newly formed AME Church. Both the Free African Society and the AME Church advocated for the universal abolition of slavery, for female suffrage, and for the education of African American children. And by 1840, over 10 private schools for African American children had opened in the city of Philadelphia alone. This portrait of Absalom Jones was painted by Raphael Peale, the son of Charles Wilson Peale, whom we mentioned earlier as the man who enslaved Moses Williams, the silhouette artist. The fact that Peale did this portrait of Absalom Jones was an indication of the high regard with which Jones was held in the entire community. A third factor in the growth of an African-American middle class was the emergence of African-American entrepreneurs such as James Forten, whose business success as a sailmaker allowed him to sponsor many civic enterprises to benefit the African-American community there. Those conditions translated into a large population of potential patrons for budding African-American artists. Forten's portrait was painted by an African-American artist, Robert Douglas Jr. He was one of those artists who satisfied Philadelphia's African-Americans' middle-class desires for portraits. Next. Robert M. Douglas Jr. was born in Philadelphia, the son of Robert Douglas and Grace Bustille. Robert was a sign maker, a lithographer, and a portrait painter. Douglas, who also worked abroad for a while, was also an abolitionist and the brother of suffragette Sarah Mapps Douglas. Douglas was famous for a lithograph he made of William Lloyd Garrison, which you can see on the screen. Next. Robert Douglas also taught art to his cousin, David Bustille Bowser, in Philadelphia. Bowser practiced the applied arts of engraving and graphic design to make a living. He was famous for a portrait he made of Abraham Lincoln and of the many banners he made of African-American regiments during the Civil War. Next. Patrick Reason of Philadelphia practiced the applied arts of engraving and graphic design to facilitate earning income. Reason completed portraits for the abolitionist cause, including ones of Henry Bibb and James Williams, two authors of famous slave narratives. But he was most well known for an illustration entitled Kneeling Slave for an abolitionist poster, which was very widely circulated. Next. William H. Simpson was another African-American portrait artist during this period who found patrons in the African-American middle class. Simpson was originally from Buffalo, New York, but he eventually relocated to Boston, and he had many clients throughout New England and the mid-Atlantic states. His portrait of Bishop Logan is indicative of his ability to sensitively portray his sitters. Simpson successfully captured Logan's keen intellect, courageous spirit, confidence, and dominant personality. Logan was a fugitive from slavery who escaped to New York State, where he became an ardent abolitionist, a leader of the Underground Railroad, and New York bishop of the AME Church. Next. There was also a parallel development of African-American portrait artists who came out of New Orleans. One of the three artists we will look at who was nurtured by the special culture of New Orleans was Jules Lyon. Lyon was born in France of mixed parentage, and he moved to New Orleans where he introduced the daguerreotype. A photographer and lithographer, most of Lyon's subjects were wealthy white enslavers. His portrait of Asher Nathan Moses and Son is one of the few that depict a white father with his biracial child. New Orleans had been ruled by the French from 1682 until 1863. and then by the Spanish until 1803 when it became an American territory. That history allowed a culture to evolve that resulted in very different attitudes toward racial relations that then existed in the rest of the United States. The French Code Noir governed racial relations and it regulated emancipation. Free people of color had the same rights as whites, including the right to enslave other people themselves. And there were numerous routes for enslaved people to gain their freedom. Next. The second of those artists was Julian Hudson. Hudson was born free in New Orleans to a white father and a free African-American mother. His mother's real estate investments and steady income allowed him to be educated by private tutors at home. After studying art in Paris, Hudson returned to New Orleans and opened a studio from which he painted the portraits of New Orleans society. The intermingling between the races in New Orleans developed a large middle-class society of freed Africans and mixed race individuals who were known as Creoles, such as Hudson's family. That society was governed by a very complex hierarchy of rules and regulations. In that city, the French had established legal and hereditary rights for free mistresses of color and their children through the institution of placage. This level of intermingling of the races started to slowly change as early as 1792, when thousands of African Haitians and French Haitians fled the revolution in their native country. That influx gradually led to a society in New Orleans that would eventually closely resemble racial relations in the rest of the United States. So much so that by 1830, the state issued an order that all free people of color who arrived after 1825 had to leave the state. Next. The third of those artists, Eugene Warburg, was born enslaved in New Orleans in 1826 and manumitted by his father at the age of 4. Warburg showed an early aptitude for art, and after studying and working in New Orleans, he relocated to Paris in 1852 to perfect his craft, and perhaps as a result of the changing mores of his hometown. Warburg practiced in Paris for the remainder of his short life. Despite the complicated societal regulations in place, these three African-American portrait artists, Jules Lyon, Julian Hudson, and Eugene Warburg, were born out of this mixed society, and they benefited from the patronage of the large Creole and African-American middle class and wealthy whites. Next. In the period leading up to the Civil War, African-American artists began to respond to the political upheavals that were disrupting the country, and the outcome of those upheavals was that those artists began to develop a creative freedom that released them from simply reproducing realistic portraits, especially since photography was now entering the mainstream. Next. Those artists began to develop artistic aspirations that had a more philosophical grounding than in the past. They began to explore art as idea, especially as it could be explored through landscape painting. It was that development that inspired the next group of artists, Robert Duncanson, Grafton Tyler Brown, and Edward Bannister. All three of those artists found their creative expression in the two schools of landscape painting that dominated the American art scene. Duncanson and Brown gravitated toward the romanticism of the Hudson River School of landscape painting, which included artists such as Frederick Edwin Church. And Edward Mitchell Bannister found his identity in the realism of the Barbers School of painting, which was popularized by artists such as William Morris Hunt. Although both styles of painting were radically different, both centered nature, not man, as their focal point. This focus on landscape painting for some artists and the fact that they found solace in it as the country was moving towards experiencing and recovering from the most devastating war in our history, a war fought to keep African Americans subservient to whites, appeared as a subconscious desire of the African American artists to contemplate a world where nature dominated, a world free from the artificial limitations imposed by man. Next. Robert Duncanson was born free in New York State, but his family moved to Ohio, where he took up carpentry and house painting. Duncanson taught himself oil painting, and by his late 20s, he was working full-time as an oil painter. Inspired by the landscape artist Thomas Cole, Duncanson set out to become the greatest landscape painter of all time. In 1848, he captured the attention of Nicholas Longworth, a wealthy attorney who commissioned him to paint 8 large-scale murals directly onto the walls of a mansion Longworth was building in Cincinnati. The mansion later became home to the brother of William Howard Taft, the 27th President of the United States. Today, it is known as the Taft Museum and is a National Historic Landmark because of the murals that Duncanson painted there. That commission led to others, and Duncanson soon was inundated with work. Throughout his life, Duncanson was particularly sensitive to suggestions of his racial inferiority, so he decided to focus on his craft rather than social causes, even though many in his family and his patrons were leaders in the anti-slavery movement. Duncanson developed a unique style that combined the majesty of the Hudson River School with romanticism. And the painting in the lower right-hand corner, the rainbow, was unveiled by President Biden at his inauguration. Next. Grafton Tyler Brown was a landscape artist whose affiliation to the Hudson River School's philosophy of representing nature, the majestic, was in tune to his personal beliefs. Born free in Pennsylvania, Brown learned printmaking and lithography before he decided to take the advice that was being given to many young men to go west to seek their fortune. Brown exercised his freedom of movement and set out for San Francisco in 1858, where he was in awe of the majesty of the West. Brown's primary activity was the mundane business of drawing maps, documenting settlements, land claims, and property boundaries. But his artistic activity was exploring the majesty of the West, a world truly without artificial boundaries. Next. Robert Scott Duncanson painted majestic landscapes because he wanted to prove to everyone that he was the greatest painter ever. Grafton Tyler Brown painted majestic landscapes because he was truly in awe of the monumental landscapes that he experienced in the West. Edward Bannister, who was a very religious man, considered the spiritual expression of nature as the goal of the artist, not realistic representation of some majestic setting. Bannister was born in 1828 in New Brunswick, Canada, which is right across the border with Maine. His father, also named Edward Bannister, was of African heritage from Barbados, and his mother, Hannah Bannister, was white and a native of New Brunswick. He also had an older brother, William. Bannister's early interest in art was encouraged by his mother, as shown in the drawing on the screen that he did early on. The death of both parents devastated Bannister. His brother moved to Boston, and Bannister boarded with a local prominent white family for a few years, where he continued to draw. It was in that household where he fell in love with classical literature and music, a love which stayed with him throughout his life. Bannister eventually moved to Boston to join his brother, and in Boston, Bannister became a barber. Boston did not cultivate as strong an African-American middle-class community as Philadelphia or New Orleans, but because of its abolitionist activities, and since it was a major stop on the Underground Railroad, Boston became a cultural mecca for the African-American community in New England. Barbershops were common stops on the Underground Railroad and key sources of information for abolitionists and fugitives, so Bannister would have been aware of those activities. He worked as a barber by day, a trade that elevated him into the higher social status in the African-American community. And at night, he took art lessons at the Lowell Institute. He also participated in exhibitions at the Boston Art Club. Edward Bannister intuitively realized that he needed to integrate himself into the local art scene because that social mingling with his peers was critical in helping him to develop his skills as an artist. By the time Bannister married Christina Carto, who was of Narragansett and African-American heritage in 1858, he had fully immersed himself into abolitionist and anti-slavery activity because Mrs. Carto, a successful business owner, was an early activist. When the Civil War broke out, she lobbied for equal pay for Black soldiers. She also organized the Soldiers' Relief Fair. Edward Bannister painted a full-length portrait of Colonel Shaw of the Massachusetts 54th Regiment for that fair. That painting has since been lost. Mrs. Bannister also fully supported Edward's art career, and she encouraged him to quit working as a barber and to develop himself to his art full time. Although through Mrs. Carto Bannister's social connections, Edward was able to establish a successful career as the portrait painter of choice for the African-American middle class in Boston. By the time he painted this portrait of Mrs. Carto Bannister, his reputation was on its way to being firmly established. Next. Bannister continued to visit local art galleries, such as the Boston Athenaeum, where he became exposed to the work of the French Barbers School of Painters, including Jean-Francois Millet and his American counterparts, Constance Troyon and William Morris Hunt. The Barbers School was a style of landscape painting that emphasized the intimate and poetic quality of nature. And that style struck a chord in Bannister because it was in tune with his spiritual nature. He also painted a few genre paintings during this time, such as this one, which was entitled Newspaper Boy. Next. It was frequently reported that Bannister was irked after he read an article in an 1867 issue of the New York Herald. Quote, "The Negro seems to have an appreciation of art while being manifestly unable to produce it," unquote. Bannister decided to make it his life's mission to disprove the article. In 1870, the Bannisters moved to Providence, Rhode Island, where they became socially prominent members of the African-American community there. Bannister also embedded himself with the art community, and that association provided him with a network of peers that helped to insulate him against the prejudice and discrimination that all African Americans experience. In 1876, Bannister entered his painting Under the Oaks in the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition of that year. That painting has been lost, but this one, which is entitled Oak Trees, is thought to be similar in style to that award-winning painting. Under the Oaks won the first prize bronze medal, and learning that the award-winning painting had been painted by an African-American sent shockwaves through the crowd. This is from Bannister's memory of the incident. Quote, "Upon learning that number 54 had received a first prize medal, I hurried to the committee room where I gained the attention of an official who demanded in a most exasperating tone of voice, 'Well, what do you want here anyway? Speak lively.' 'I want to inquire concerning number 54. Is it a prize winner?' I replied. 'What's that to you?' he said. In an instant, my blood was up. Controlling myself, I said with deliberation, 'I am interested in the report that Under the Oaks has received a prize. I painted that picture.' The explosion of a bomb could not have created more of a sensation in that room. Without hesitation, the official apologized to me, and soon all were bowing and scraping to me," unquote. The judges reportedly wanted to reconsider the award when they discovered that Bannister was African American, but pressure from his white peers forced them to allow the award to stand. The location of that award-winning painting has never been found and is not known. Bannister's success allowed him the economic leisure to sail his boat extensively in Narragansett Bay, where he indulged in the study of cloud formations for hours. In 1880, Edward Bannister became one of the 7 founders of the Providence Art Club, the precursor to today's Rhode Island School of Design. Bannister often tried to achieve in his paintings an affirmation of the harmony and spirituality in what he called all things created. Realistic representation was not his goal, but he wanted to capture the spirit of the harmony of nature. Thank you. And these are further paintings by Edward Bannister after the award-winning painting in 1876. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosalyn, for that fascinating talk. I'm enjoying the response from our attendees here. I've been really enjoying this great edifice of history. You've placed Bannister atop here. I'm noting that you are speaking directly to the art historical profession and teaching us all a thing or two today. You have representation here from curators quickly going down the list in Maine, Ohio, Pennsylvania, scholars in DC, the Bay Area. So yeah, you've really helped us out. And I'm eager to learn more about this person. You've gotten us off to a great start here. We have some questions submitted. I have some of my own, so many threads to draw out here. First and foremost, thank you for sharing this perspective with us. Thank all of you for your interest in Olana's programs, for being members. If you're not a member already, please consider joining. One thread that I'm interested in is this unexpected rhyme between these two great African-American landscape painters of the middle decades of the 19th century. Duncanson and Bannister both have this Canadian story, and I think that hasn't been talked about enough. I'm curious if in your research on Bannister, you've found that birth experience continued to be relevant to him at all. Did he have any continued ties to New Brunswick, or he goes full Rhode Island and that's part of the past?
Well, I guess you could say he went full Boston first and then Rhode Island.
Rhode Island, yeah.
Yes, because his brother had already moved to Boston. He and his parents had died. He basically was an orphan by the time that he moved. He really did cut ties with Canada.
Okay. One interesting question from a colleague at the Brandywine River Museum, hello Amanda, glad to see you logged in here, was interest in this fascinating figure of Moses Williams and the commenting on the lack of understanding we have of the African Americans who were supporting the great public figure of Charles Wilson Peale. Is there any source or reference you found on that elusive figure that would help us understand Moses Williams better?
I think there's more research needs to be done. He was, information on him is integrated in different art history books that I've studied, but there's been no exhaustive study of him. But quite a few of his silhouettes, not obviously, but quite a few of them are still in existence. So I think it's something that another historian could certainly take up. And there's a lot of information about the Peale family, obviously, so. Yes, but I don't have a direct single resource that I can point to. The information was integrated throughout various texts.
I see. Maybe this should be your next book. Why not you? You've already made such great inroads here. To continue the theme of picking up threads in the edifice of support for the case of Bannister you've built up here. Another of these fascinating case studies that interested me and others was this figure of David Bowser. Is there any way we can learn more about this fascinating story of painting Civil War banners?
Yes, again, there is no definitive book on Bowser by himself. What I found is that a lot of these artists, information about them, there's a paragraph here and a paragraph there, and you pretty much just have to piece those paragraphs together. But because, probably because for a lot of the artists, a lot of their art has been lost. And that makes it difficult. If you can't find a source of the art, it's hard to sort of have that information available. So again, Bowser, he was a cousin of Robert Douglas, which, is interesting because there's that family connection. But yes, and he painted quite a few Civil War banners. And I think quite a few of those banners are in different historical museums around the Northeast. But
Okay.
information about him. One thing about Bowser, though, is that I did read that he and his wife also ran a very successful business in, the sort of the sign painting and painting these banners. It was a business. It wasn't just art. That was a business. He was commissioned to paint the banners. So he ran it as a business also.
I see. Fascinating. One question I see emerging from multiple people here is we are all eager to spend more time with Bannister's art. What are the major public collections of Bannister's paintings? Where can we see more? And then there's a specific sub question. Where can we see more of Bannister on the Rhode Island coast?
Oh, well, the museum in Providence has quite a collection of Bannister's work. The Museum of Fine Arts in in Boston has quite a collection, and he's represented in collections all across the country. The Metropolitan, all the Smithsonian has quite a few. In fact, I think the Smithsonian probably has the largest collection of Bannister paintings.
Yeah, it's a great collection, the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and they're doing good work to tell this story as well. Speaking of which, we have their wonderful painting conservator asking a question here, Gwen Manthe. Hello, Gwen. I'd love to know more about Bannister in the studio. I understand he shared studios with Edmonia Lewis. Just blew my mind. I had no idea. Tell me more. Was Bannister considered an artist of means, or did he have to regularly reuse materials? I see a lot of reuse in my study of his archives and from the artworks themselves. There we go. We have a voice from one of these great public repositories and one of the rising generation of leading painting conservators of 19th century American landscape. So great to have your question, Gwen.
Okay, I'm not a conservator, so I don't have expertise in his techniques, but once he married, his marriage freed him from the burden of working. So he actually acted as a mentor to other African-American artists. And I'm not sure that he shared a studio with Edmonia Lewis, but he definitely was her mentor. And I didn't mention Edmonia Lewis. I was really torn to the very end because I was trying to draw the theme of portrait painters and what led, in the portrait painters from the past. And Edmonia Lewis, as people know, was a sculptor.
Trying to show my Edmonia stamps that happen to be right next to me here, but yeah, you get the idea. Whatever.
Yes, she was a sculptor, and her life was much different from Bannister's. By the time Edmonia Lewis arrived in Boston, Bannister was established, but he took her under his wings. He was very generous. He was actually in communication with William Simpson and to some small extent other African-American artists. So he was very generous with his time and trying to sort of build a large tent of African-American peers, because his peers were primarily those other white artists. And I think he was concerned about, the fact that African-American artists were not being given the same opportunities.
Understood. That's interesting to hear, and that reminds me of one of the threads in my response. I guess inevitably we're in the Frederick Church business to a certain extent at Olana, and you were reminding me of some aspects of what we understand about the person who built this place behind me, that he was also that kind of mentor to another generation, very civically involved. You reminded me of that with the mention of the Soldiers Fair, the benefit held to support soldiers in the Civil War, not unlike the New York Sanitary Fair that Church was an important lender to. So some interesting threads there. Church also as a supporter of the African-American still life painter Charles Ethan Porter, a whole other story we could go into. I see a thread in two different questions that maybe I can connect into one, which is people are eager to hear more about Bannister in Boston. Part A of this question is his connections with Boston abolitionists like Lewis and Harriet Hayden and Governor John Andrew, names that I do not know, but it sounds like I should. And the second part of this Boston focused question is we'd love to hear more about the significance of the Lowell Institute.
Okay. Bannister's wife was actually very prominent in abolitionist activities in Boston, Christina Carto Bannister. He was not as much. He became active as spouse because of his marriage, but he wasn't really overly active in those communities? And that's a hard question to sort of parcel out, because when I say overly active, it depends on your definition of overly active. For example, when his wife organized the relief fair, he painted a full-size painting of Colonel Shaw, which that's a lot of activity. But I think that was his contribution. When Edmonia Lewis actually sold crafts at the fair, he arranged through his wife for Edmonia to get a table to sell her busts. She did busts of different abolitionists at the time. That was her way of earning money to save to go to Rome, to go to Europe. So they arranged for her to have a table at the fair. But as far as him organizing rendezvous with enslaved people, was that the question?
I think it was more generally about how he was a part of the abolitionist world. So I think maybe
I think he generally supported it. I mean, he supported it by supplying art to different causes. They opened up their house to groups to meet there, but again, he wasn't a speaker on the circuit.
Understood. I see a great question here from our friend Carolyn at Olana, our director of programs, who spoke to you at the beginning. She asked a very good question. Have you come across museums, historic sites, other arts and culture nonprofits that are doing a good job, a leading role in putting a spotlight on these undertold stories? Are there places we should be looking to? That is, museums and institutions.
Well, there are various African American history museums throughout the country. In Boston, we have the museum there's a museum called the Museum of African American Art that focuses on fine art. And then there's the Museum of African American History that puts on exhibits on a regular basis that helps to highlight the history. As far as highlighting the history of the artist, that's not as much, that's not done as much as it should be. I think that hopefully in the era that we are now in, more museums are understanding that people are interested in the whole history of American art, and they are trying to seek ways to bring the history to the forefront. But and I should say, contemporary art, contemporary African American artists are much more well known than the more historical figures.
Yes, indeed. There's one question that's been nagging on my own mind before getting to some more from our attendees here, which is I'd just like to invite you to speculate a little bit about why this life that, at least in its dates, is so aligned with that of Frederick Church or that of Robert Seldon Duncanson. Why do you think he was drawn to that more mystical, subjective, European mode of landscape painting rather than the romantic realist mode that was equally in fashion in his lifetime and very much a through line there? And to mention one American name that kept coming up besides those Barbers painters you quite rightly name, a lot of his work looks a lot like George Inness, another of these fringe figures hard to put in a box in the 19th century art world. So why doesn't he paint like Duncanson, in short?
Bannister was very spiritual. And for him, his art was an expression of his spirituality. So he painted what he felt. And I think that when he saw that Barbizon School of Painters, an exhibition and several exhibitions that occurred over, the time he was in Boston, it struck a chord with him. Just like, when you see something, it strikes a chord with you and you seek it out. And so he was seeking that out. I think that his spiritual nature did not gravitate toward the majestic in nature or anything else. It was a very intimate type of spirituality. And I should say, I don't know, I didn't mention, but Bannister never traveled to Europe. So he did not travel much at all. He went from Canada. He spent a little time in New York City, but that was a real tight community, geographical area that he pretty much stayed in his entire life. Whereas some of the other artists, they were more expansive in their travels. Duncanson traveled everywhere. I mean, he really did. He traveled to Europe. he was very, because he saw that as, he wanted to expand himself, but I guess he wanted to also just see more. Whereas Bannister, so I would say Duncanson was looking outward to the world to find, how he could represent nature. Bannister was more inward looking. He would go on long walks. He would sort of take his boat by himself and sail, along the Narragansett Bay, just contemplating nature. And, that was not the vista that, say, Duncanson saw or, Grafton Tyler Brown saw. I mean, they saw this expansive, majestic, grand vista that, it's like, wow, but Bannister was like, looking into the crystal ball, and he saw, wow, there's just a difference. There was an outward and an inward.
That's really insightful. I like that. And maybe to put it differently, maybe he's like an explorer of the inner world, while Duncanson and Church and all these globe travelers are needing those sublime cliffs and mountains and snow-capped peaks. He is this kind of inward character who is offering similar insights with perhaps humbler subject matter. Fascinating figure. One question here, and as you've walked with this artist for a while, have you come across any living relatives of Bannister or his wife? Are there people who are still by blood connected to this person? Are there other similar stories out there that need to be researched like Bannister's? Two questions from one person.
Wow, I haven't come across any. They didn't have children, so that sort of limited, that history there.
I see.
So, and I'm not sure if William Bannister, his brother, had children or not. I'm really just not certain about that. But Bannister, he did not have children from his marriage. And again, I don't know Christina's family, if, what relatives she may have had. So I can't, no, I do not know that answer.
That might be our last couple of questions now here, and we're perfectly on time, trying to end by 7. I see 2 that I think we can combine as one, which could be under the broader heading of reception history. You painted such a vivid picture of that climactic moment, the argument in favor of blind auditions and all these things that orchestras are doing in the world right now. When you actually make an aesthetic judgment on pure objective visual data in front of you, maybe surprising things can happen in a repressed and racist society. A fascinating moment there where people were forced to confront this talent in front of them. Do you see that as a persistent thread in his life? Are there other stories of hostile critical response? Who was buying his paintings? Did you find anything about his patrons beyond what you've shared already? Is it fair to say generally that in your experience, the reactions of art critics to the work of African-American artists were unwelcoming and unfriendly?
Well, that's a twofold question, because I think Bannister, because of his nature, he was able to cultivate an environment where people supported him. He did develop this group of peers. As I mentioned, it was his group of peers, his network of peers, that pushed the Philadelphia Centennial to make that award stand. So he and his patrons were white and Black before he started landscape painting. And that's something I didn't really examine, because he was a portrait painter of the African American middle class. And it was only when he saw those Barbers on exhibits that he started gravitating toward landscape painting. And soon he just went, full steam ahead on just landscape painting. But but I don't think that necessarily explains his patrons. His patrons were a mixed group, because the portraits he had been painting of African Americans, I'm sure they collected his landscape paintings as well. And then he had quite a large group of white patrons as well. So and that again is something I should have explained a little bit more, but that is also why his career was so different, because other artists of the period, they just did not get that level of acceptance. And I think for Bannister, he really tried, and and he was not a race man in the sense that, you know, he did not give speeches about, you know, anti-slavery speeches, but he was fully supportive of that cause. So it's not like he hid behind sort of a neutral philosophy about race. He was his own man. And that was strong enough for him to continue to do what he wanted to do. And for the people that enjoyed his art, that was enough for them.
He was his own man is a good note to end on there. Thank you so much for this really fascinating overview of a cultural milieu, a context that helps to explain this figure who is still insufficiently understood. You've really helped us all in this effort as Olana and other institutions try to raise up these stories from the past that have been rather less well preserved than the ones for which we're best known. Thank you all for being with us today. Don't forget to pick up a copy of Rosalyn Elder's book, Exploring the Legacy, People, and Places of Significance. If you're not a member of, there it is, excellent. If you're not a member of the Olana Partnership already, please consider joining and come back for more great talks on undertold stories soon, including that next one Carolyn mentioned earlier on Emily Cole. So more to come. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.